Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam,
Hello, hello.
and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
So we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey, Matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts.
And today we're talking about the concept of mythologizing and mythologizing in matcha and mythologizing in tea more generally. So I was recently listening to a podcast about Chinese tea. I'm really also into Chinese tea, and so is Sam. And it was about pu'er and this concept of mythologizing a place or a style is, it's really common across all tea. And sometimes some places or some regions or some methods get mythologized so much that it kind of eats all the oxygen in the room. So some really classic examples from the Chinese tea world are like gushu trees. If you go to like some random tea market in China and you're shopping for tea and like gushu is probably in your vocabulary. It means old tree or ancient tree. It should refer to trees that are over 100 years old, but sometimes it can be even a little less, maybe around 70 years old. You go around and everyone's trying to push you. This is gushu cha, gushu cha. And it feels very similar to like uji, for example. Like
Mm.
there's just these names that just you and terminology that like people are educated to learn and know and look for. Um, there's a lot of fakes. So, for example, within Gushu tea, most of the Gushu tea that people think that they're buying probably doesn't come from 100-year-old trees. And we know, at least legally and structurally, when you're buying Uji matcha, it's not coming from Uji. It doesn't need to be processed in Uji. It's kind of riding off of this thing that has been mythologized so much that it's where the demand concentrates. It's a center, becomes a center of gravity for demand and education. And it starts creating these interesting, what I like to think of as doom loop cycles. And, Uji, this is going to be part of in my Uji matcha piece later. But like people want Uji matcha, and because people want Uji matcha, like consumers want Uji matcha, there's an incentive for vendors to find Uji matcha and write about Uji matcha and learn about the place of Uji and reference the terroir of Uji, and the history of Uji, and it just creates this like concentration of focus. And the reality is that Uji produces 37 tons of matcha a year, and across the four prefecture zone, it represents about 1 to 2% by volume. So most of the tea that all of this mythologizing is being dumped into is actually incredibly scarce. There's like not very much of it that's actually made, and even less of it that is saved for a single origin product. So this is something that affects, all parts of the tea world.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think it's just tea. It's so prevalent in other places too. Coffee, wine, kind of see this pattern happening in all sorts of products, artisanal products, specialty products that's being sold beyond its agricultural or consumption value.
Yeah.
This is, a romance, a marketing story mostly that people construct so that, they can essentially in reality, the goal is to add a higher price tag or trying to sell a concept of scarcity for a certain product. Like if you really look into it, like these are all just different facades of ceremonial grade. Like all of these names that people looking for, it's a tendency. Like people want to look for like labels that signifies a higher quality product. And for most of the consumers, these labels are knowledge they end up learning when they get into a product. And, symbols or indicators they will be forecasting if they would indeed getting a better product compared to something else.
Yeah.
So like gushu, or something like a made in uji or uji cha, or even you see this kind of geographical relationships between higher quality, and it's not just uji, right? Like in pu'er too, like people associate a certain area with naturally higher quality, but in fact, it doesn't necessarily being the case. Some xiaoshu in a very famous region called Manzong, which its tea has been historically sold for, tens of thousands of RMB per kg on average.
So xiaoshu referring to small trees.
small trees, and gushu or qiaomu referring to larger trees, and then beyond qiaomu you have gushu, which refers to ancient trees. So you have all these terms that are essentially not regulated at all. There's no way for consumers to verify if a tea is indeed come from a different size of trees just sitting in front of you for you to decide if it's up to your quality or if you're willing to pay for that price. It's actually quite interesting, and somehow it has also sometimes evolved into a test. Like if you do not have the capability of taste the difference between a xiaoshu and a gushu or a qiaomu, then you deserve to pay the higher price. They call this a intelligence tax in Chinese. It's very interesting. And but I think the ultimate reason for this phenomenon to exist is that it's marketing. Vendors need a romance, a story to sell a product with better profit. And consumers are looking for these romance to either convince themselves to pay for a higher price or, tell their friends that, this is a interesting product that I acquired recently and, share the product and the story at the same time.
It's really good at creating the desire. If you go back to like if you think about mythology and myths in general, right? Like there's usually some sort of lesson baked in. There's usually some sort of like origin story. Like if you go back to Greek mythology about the way things are and why they're like that, and, different moral lessons. And, it's a way to tapping into sort of humankind's greater past and connection to other people from the past. I mean, really interesting thing about matcha, like let's just cherry pick one mythology or over mythologized thing within matcha is that Zen Buddhist monks used it for meditation. And this was like part of the reason or how it came to Japan. And monks have been using it for centuries to meditate and to stay focused and to keep calm during meditation. But when you really dig into it, like if you go back to the Kamakura period and those records when tea, when it first entered Japan, was gaining its first footholds, some of the earliest writings about tea in Japan was how good of a hangover cure it was. And like one of the past kings or emperors, I forget his name, was like heralding it as a wonderful hangover cure. But like that is not a myth that very many people are interested compared to like this is what Zen monks, it's some secret mythical herb and tea that Zen monks used. Like it's such a more interesting story than hangover cure for someone who drank too much the previous night.
Actually, functionally, I've seen this story being used by some, this Japanese drugstores. Like they sell all these kind of hangover cures on the shelf nearby your favorite Ajinomoto sleep aid. One of the product was a matcha hangover cure.
Oh, really?
I bet they recycled the story from that from that tell.
And like, most of the, matcha's mythologized past about connections to tea ceremony and Senyorikyu and Hideyoshi during that period, also like it was really just vanity. Like it was this thing that you got together with a bunch of
Mm,
other
yeah,
people
yeah.
to talk politics and with really expensive teaware. And like, the Japanese have done actually just such a good job. Even Chanayu has done such a good job mythologizing all
Oh,
of the best parts. Like
everything. Like the
everything gets all the like the grit and the grime other than the wabi sabi just kind of gets plastered
uh,
over in these narratives.
but yeah, it's almost like anti wabi sabi if you think about it. Like all these bromance that they talk about relating to like the teaware sitting in the room. Like
Or the inclusiveness,
mm,
everyone's equal, and so you have to bow down by the little the little door when you enter a tea room. Like it's so much more vanity than substance, most likely, when you dig into these histories. Like there were no women allowed in those rooms, so I guess the people that were allowed in were in theory equal, but whether or not it looked like that in practice, when the owner of the tea house who brought together this gathering was showing off his equivalent of $10,000 tea bowl he got from Song Dynasty China.
yeah.
It's very and so mythologizing kind of makes sense. Like, it's a nice story to tell someone that doesn't know the history, doesn't care about the history, that wants to feel connection to something larger than themselves. But where it gets in the way and where the real problem of over mythologizing is where it um attributes success or quality to the wrong things. And I think Uji matcha is a wonderful example. If you take the four prefecture zone for what can be considered Uji matcha, it's about a third. Maybe it's a slightly less, but about a third of the matcha produced in Japan can be called Uji matcha. There is a extremely large percentage of that material that is incredibly mediocre, and it gets to ride on a famous name. So we're talking about Uji, 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 and how it's incredible. It's not even Uji. You can argue maybe it's a processing style, but that processing style can be really like reproduced elsewhere. There's some really interesting stories we know of tea farmers in actual Uji that had farmers from Kagoshima come up and do kind of an understudy to shadow them to learn how to learn from them and bring those techniques back to Kagoshima. So there's all sorts of this cross learning that's going on in the industry. So, like, not only is it disingenuous if you're thinking about it as a single origin product, and even a little bit as a style, but it just allows it's not because it's from Uji that the matcha is any good, and it's not even from Uji. And the deeper you go, you realize that if you like stack rank the things that make matcha taste good, the first at the list is probably like fertilizer, and then maybe like cultivar and processing and shading style. And you could argue maybe the hand picked stuff. And there's some stack rank, and maybe there's some disagreement on what the stack rank is. But the actual soil, the actual dirt, the actual microclimate and micro terroir, whatever word you want to use, doesn't actually explain the quality. So you have all of these vendors all over the place talking about Kagoshima volcanic soil, or like really mountain natural tea in Shizuoka, or Uji matcha in these beautiful river basins and river beds, river tea. We're mythologizing so heavily that even if it were true that the matcha is better because it came from Uji and that there's some magic in this land and terroir, it doesn't explain why it's actually good. It's good because those farmers have so much knowledge and skill. They take care of the plants. They're only harvesting once a year. They use incredibly high quality fertilizer. And it's like the center of gravity where you have a bunch of different producers that are able to share knowledge. And they've been doing that for what, 500 years? That's why it's good. It has really nothing to do with the terroir. If someone who didn't know anything opened a new plot in Uji, the matcha probably wouldn't taste very good unless they were able to tap into like the secondary terroir. And I think this over mythologizing to the point of misattributing quality is such a huge problem because people learn the wrong lessons. It generates demand in the wrong places. And the entire matcha industry, even if you look at ceremonial grade, like what a stupid term. And like it's generating demand in the wrong places. It's supposedly good enough for Japanese tea ceremony use, but there's no underlying truth. It doesn't explain the quality. Like you're just making up reductions and complexities and stories to sell the product.
That's the goal.
Yeah, that's the goal.
That's why it happened, and that's why it's so successful. It's very effective
Yeah,
in reality. Like if you even if you debunk and demystified one term, people will invent another, and essentially consumers are pulling this invention out because they need it too.
yeah.
And
Well,
like like Asahi will probably be the new term, or like a certain type of fertilizer or shading time will be the new term, probably. Like if you keep just debunking all of these marketing jargons, and you are just pushing a substitute of a new one in the future. And for Wuji is particularly difficult because like it's not really just a place. It's not really just a style. I'm thinking this out loud, but I think in reality, Uji is a system. It's a tea making system for Japanese matcha. And all of these regions surrounding Uji, like Miya, Shiga, and all of these places, they cannot live without Uji. And you should, I think one should really consider they are a extension, a very organic extension of Uji itself, because like they are supplying Uji tea makers or Uji tea brands. They are being told how to make matcha, because this is what those Uji blend houses or tea makers need. These are suppliers for Uji too. Like, a lot of them are doing what them being told by Uji farmers. It's
There's like some contract in place. They're like, we want this fertilizer recipe, we
and
want this and this.
and they cannot sell like tea themselves. Like all of their productions gets funneled back to Uji, and it is Uji. And if you really think about the impact of terroir, it doesn't really matter for matcha that much. Like with the usage of fertilizers and shading methods and shiagate and post processing. Theoretically, you can recreate a very high quality Asahi, Hongzu Asahi in like Mie, but no one is doing that because like no one is going to pay for a higher price to make that cultivation sustainable.
This is where Uji is just basically one big black hole.
It's a big
And
black hole.
everyone has an incentive to keep it going.
I think it's constructed. It's being constructed that way so that Uji is the crown jewel of like Uji tea, like actual Uji. But all of these other places, they are like also Uji, right? Like other than the land being situated outside of Uji city, like they are everything Uji but themselves. The cultivation method, the essential market, the procurers, the final product will be blended probably sometimes with Uji tea too, like tea from Uji. Like they are part of Uji as well if you consider the whole system as one entity.
Yeah. It's just really a shame that so many people apply a single origin framework. But I disagree. I think the industry would be much healthier. I think the solution is through like the name Uji. Like we got to have more places, more names, more farmers, more regions to make this so that people can actually understand like
I totally agree. I'm just talking about the status quo.
yeah, status quo, I agree. But the problem is then you have this awful incentive loop. Consumers want Uji because that's the only thing they know, and people want to sell Uji, so they create content and educational content around Uji matcha, which is very easy to pick from because of its rich history. There's a lot to talk about. Like I couldn't even begin to tell you about the tea that's happening in Mie, the tencha that's
But
being produced there.
you can buy it.
Difficult to buy it
Very difficult.
as a single origin product,
Yep.
right? So like just obtaining that and like pulling it out of that orbit of Uji would be so hard, but it funnels on itself because that's what
And
people want, so that's what people make, and that's what people want, and that's what people make, and
And I
like
would argue that there's, at least for now, there's no Mie style tea. There's no Mie flavor.
well, for
It's
Tenchan maybe. I
yeah, yeah,
think
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
other tea maybe, but
Other tea maybe, yeah, like but for tencha for matcha, there isn't a single origin idea in Mie to begin with. They're just another supplier for Uji.
yeah, largely speaking. I mean, you do start to see more and more like separate farmers in like Nara. I'm talking to someone in Nara at the moment that is keeping as a single origin product. Mm.
And they're selling their own tea
They're
as
selling their own
their
tea, but they're also very weirdly selling Uji matcha, which is much cheaper than the Nara tea. And like
oh, that's a good
I,
strategy.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure out like what is this Uji tea you're
The
selling because it's not from Uji. I'm sure I
I
know.
think it's a really good strategy. Like when it comes to quality, the first thing that the consumer will notice and associate with is the price tag.
Yeah,
If you're selling something, more expensive than a thing that already has a quality kind of concept in consumers' mind, consumer will probably naturally think that okay, this thing is probably even better. I don't know. I want to try.
yeah,
I think it's a very good strategy to break the quality ceiling and the price ceiling.
yeah. It's an interesting strategy. It's but also it looks like single origin framework also being misapplied by the Japanese. When you're looking through like a wholesale price list and says Nara, 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 Uji, 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 like what does like how am I supposed to interpret what that means? Like it's and then it feels very invasive to ask these questions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, ultimately, it's a marketing issue for the farmers too, and And also, I would say it's like pu'er went through the same trajectory. Like it was at the time in the very beginning just pu'er tea because all tea in Yunnan gets sold and trade in a place called pu'er. And later on, like people start to have these satellite markets in different tea mountains. Then you have like Menghai tea, you have Yiwu tea, and you have all these house, which are kind of like these
Blend
proto
houses.
blend houses
They're
or
like
proto tea
Marinukyu.
houses.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Back in the days, and then um, for example, Yiwu, it's a name of a tea region. It's also the name of a regional tea trading center. So all of these sub-regions, they pick their leaves and they all got funneled into Yiwu and get sold as Yiwu tea. And and slowly, like all of these other regions become more famous. You have Wangong, you have Mahe, you have Bohetang, and all of these places start to gain their own fame because they acquired agency to sell their own tea and process their own tea later on. And the current Japanese system, I think it's just the system is so baked in with processing capability that the farmers are really having a hard time to break free. It's the processing constraints is the soil for this weirdness of, like not being able to do a more confined or more granular geographic concept
Well, a more true concept.
or more true concept. But, like it's difficult. Like even if you have, a farmer in one village that's trying to, build their own regional brand, their tea will probably still needs to be sent to like Uji to get processed, to get shiaged. And the tea will indeed be like transformed or remake in that particular region. So like it's difficult to kind of separate, other regions' influence because like as we also learned that different shiage factories, they have different, shiage flavor or
Mm.
processing flavor
And
because
then during the refinement stage.
because of their machineries, because of the style that the factory runners like the machine to be run. So they actually end up producing some very unique factory flavors on top of the farmers' creation. So it's very difficult to separate all of these influence or factors when you are talking about single origin.
And everything just gets murky because everything is over mythologized onto a very simple concept, which doesn't explain any of the quality.
Yeah, but then it's also very convenient, right, to mythologize or to take one collective right of a big brand. Like even in Uji regions, like Uji Tawala, Wazuka, right? They all it's very convenient to all get into this bandwagon because the processing a lot of these things are indeed happening in a very central location that there are a lot of cross influence and shared characteristic between all of these places.
Maybe in a growing market, but if the matcha market ever shrinks, which, I hope it doesn't, or that the demand for medium quality matcha, like what we would consider to be like average quote unquote ceremonial grade matcha, is being able to produce at half the price in China, where there is no what we would call organoleptic difference. There's a sensory difference. If you taste it blind, you're not able to distinguish quote unquote Uji ceremonial grade from one that's grown in Guizhou or Zhejiang. Every cafe, every B2B environment would do so much better to source the one that's half the price, unless they're, I don't know, maybe some Japanese associations where they want to source a product from Japan. But for the vast majority of cafes, it is actually the responsible business decision. And in this type of over mythologizing, then you are working where there is much less demand. And the people that are in the middle will kind of get screwed. The French wine industry has some interesting parallels here. People in France are drinking less and less wine. The French government actually spent close to 200 million euros last year destroying French wine and converting it into industrial alcohol. That was how much overproduction was being done in France. And Bordeaux in particularly is getting hit very, very hard. And if you're from like a famous region in Bordeaux, like Graves or Saint-Emilion, you're okay. There's a famous name to write. There's good chateaus doing interesting things, and they're still able to sell it. But if you go to regions that no one's heard of, like Côte d'Ivoire, and that don't have a very good reputation, like Côte d'Ivoire does, an average bottle of Côte d'Ivoire at a grocery store in France is like 3 or 4 euros. It's very cheap. This market is like totally evaporating. Like no one, the demand is for like these much more granular things. So they're in like a very interesting form of structural decline. So let's say that the Chinese are able to beat the cost to quality ratio so hard against the Japanese, then Uji will probably survive. But what about a mediocre producer in Wazuka, where 40% of the tencha in Kyoto is made? Or maybe Wazuka does fine. You can still call it Kyoto matcha, Kyoto tencha.
Yeah,
But
and
what about Shiga or like regions where you really have never seen it as a single origin?
then for that reality, Uji tea is going to be more valuable
To them,
to them, to everybody. That will be the only concept that will survive through this turmoil, this flush
but what if
of
demand for that
tencha.
Uji tea goes down? Like then what do you do? It's going to suppress the prices of everybody
Yeah, it's totally possible. It's totally
because it's
possible.
all riding this
I
like
mean,
semi-commodified term.
it's. I think we are a little bit overestimating the difficulty of even building a brand or a brand of a place to begin with. Like
Maybe.
for a lot of regions, there's just not going to be enough interest in the market to make it a sustainable brand. Like your wine example is actually perfect. Like all of these could be very interesting sub-regions. There's just not enough demand to support their existence.
Yeah, and there's not enough money to eventually cycle for them for the quality to improve. I mean, all these contract tencha producers in these varying regions, right? They're just told what to do by the Kyoto companies who they sign wholesale contracts with,
Mm.
right? Like, and they're probably don't, those wholesale companies probably don't want them to make Hanzu Asahi. They need good, decent, like filler bulk tea to suffice the majority of their blends that's relatively consistent year over year. But they're
That's
not making the special fertilized Hanzu whatever, it's so different.
and it is what we saw. It's just seas and seas of
Yabukita,
Yabukita and Okumidori.
Samidori, Okumidori,
Yeah.
like synthetic fertilizer, not a, like it's good, but it's not great. And there's going to be some turning point where most likely the Chinese figure out how to just do it much better and much cheaper, where you wouldn't be able to distinguish them in a blind test. And the only value that it has is that you can have this Uji name. But it's not good for consumers because like you're still misattributing quality by the fact that you were able to label it Uji matcha. It's like you're paying for this thing that's not reflective and you're educating people on these things. It's not actually reflective of what makes a high quality product.
Yeah,
It's
it's difficult,
some
but
delusion.
yeah, but it's what the market is in most cases.
I
So
was
tea is a business too, right?
Yeah, tea is a business, and most people in the business are trying to earn the business of selling tea. We're in actually a pretty weird position. And I'm sure if we were on the other side of the table, we wouldn't be have any incentive to say these things. But I was at the Berlin Tea Festival last year, and I listened to the CEO of Aya. Aya is a very interesting company. I need to do a deep dive, research deep dive into them. They are one of the largest companies in Nishio, but they are the quiet powerhouse behind the majority of the matcha industry. I've been told by someone who works at the Hamburg office of Aya in Europe that they're the largest matcha producer in the world in terms of the amount of volume that's produced, and they do tons of white label product. But the CEO of Aya Europe gave a talk at the Berlin Tea Festival, and one of the attendees asked a really interesting question. She must have a lot of insider knowledge or something, but she was asking about his thoughts about Guizhou matcha and whether or not his thoughts are about all of this Chinese matcha and tencha that's being produced. And he's like, it's like wine. It's like you could never have champagne out of champagne. China will never produce the same product. I was a little bit flabbergasted to hear that answer from him. where this over mythologizing of Japan was coming out. And it's just not intellectually honest. When you really are an expert about matcha, right? Like you realize that is not what determines matcha quality. We've had so many experts on this podcast that say, quote, you could theoretically grow great matcha anywhere.
Yeah, it's really not terroir driven.
It's not terroir driven. It's mostly coming from the fertilizer and all of the process. It's like literally the most processed tea I can think of. The most human intervention, most processed, most energy intensive, especially with the cold chain and keeping everything cold and not degrading. And she just took the answer. One, I was kind of shocked because I didn't think it was very intellectually honest from someone that is supposed to be, a world expert in matcha. But the other was this huge irony is that Aya is one of the earliest investors into China, specifically into Zhejiang province in China in the early 2000s, setting up subsidiaries making matcha. They have a lot of the matcha that you see in the States is probably coming from Aya, that's in the middle end. And Abby, the matcha scientist, just put out a reel. She got a tip and did some taste testing. And she's pretty sure that the Dunkin' Donuts matcha comes from Aya. So they also supply some others, and I won't
Yeah.
mention it because I don't want to violate anyone's trust. But it's
I
it,
mean,
it
like it's
it's this over mythologizing of Japan, but Aya rides on Japan's fame.
first. They're a tea brand. They're a tea manufacturer.
Yeah, they're trying to sell
They're
tea.
trying to sell tea, and for now, Uji tea is like the product or the brand name that you can sell your product under, with the largest premium, so to speak. And if in the future like
Well,
Uyishan matcha becomes like the new like rock star terroir, then I bet Aya would like talk like all these new stories about Uyishan and,
Well,
and Uyishan matcha.
we heard some gossip that Aya just set up a new factory in Kyoto Prefecture. So they can buy that tencha from the four prefecture zone and do their shiage and milling in Kyoto Prefecture. I think it's somewhere in
There
the
we go.
north or something. Boom, you've minted a new Uji matcha factory.
Yeah, they're
Um,
marrying the system.
from producers coming from Nishio. And there's also something called the blend rule where you can call it something something blend, like Uji matcha blend, which can contain up to 50% other tea.
But not
And there is
regulated.
no rule that I can find, and I've done a lot of searching, that stipulates it has to be uh, a Japanese product. So it's very possible, and we know that there's tencha flowing. And I don't know if Ai is doing this, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of quote uji matcha blends that contain Chinese tencha. So now we're calling it Uji matcha, saying it's special because it comes from Uji or the heritage of Uji. But the people doing the processing don't need to have any heritage in Uji. They just need to set it up geographically in Kyoto Prefecture. So in the case of Aya, right, they're taking Nishio in Aichi Prefecture knowledge and processing, which is a very interesting matcha history too, which we want to cover at some point. Putting it into Uji and would probably, as far as I can tell, legally bring in Chinese tencha to call something an uji matcha blend. And the crazy thing is, if you care about quality, it actually doesn't even matter. Like, they can probably create a very good tasting product.
Yeah, no, and
So uji is just so mythologized to the point where it's clouding out all of this other stuff.
yeah, it's a system. It's a system. It really is a system.
It's a
Yeah.
history, it's a cultivation system, it's a processing style system, it's a brand system, it's an ecosystem system.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, it's a meta system.
there's so many layers to this onion.
Yeah, yeah.
Where I have a problem is where it feels very deceptive. And I'm not talking about any specific company right now, but like I'm talking with a lot of people trying to source tencha and talking to people in Japan, and people get very cagey very fast. Like asking, does it come from Uji grown tencha, in some cases feels very inappropriate. But this ambiguity, this vagueness, this lack of transparency often feels like someone is trying to profit off of my ignorance. And not just mine, but really everyone's ignorance. I wouldn't be surprised, when random matcha founders go to find single origin Uji matcha, that they ask, is this from Uji? They just get an answer, yes. And there's no way that the person that answered yes, like, didn't like, they would just have to be stupid not to see through what question they were actually trying to ask,
Yeah, yeah.
especially
But
when they're trying to
I
orient everything as single origin.
I think the solution to the problem is very difficult. We talk about how like intertwined everyone is to the system right now, and how everyone is actually indeed benefiting from having this system in place. We like talking about more granular geographic regions will certainly make it more interesting and valuable as a consumer to learn about a product. But from a business standpoint, it's not viable for most of the farmers. And there is no alternative ways for them to make their farming practice and business sustainable in the future for the time being. And creating more granular geographic concept, you might actually run into, just creating another Uji, paradox.
Mm.
It's if there's no regulatory entity or law in place, you're just creating another Uji by the end of the day. It's like what Yame is kind of going to be right now. And that this all of these regions that just get lumped into a larger concept that's easier to sell tea, and and I don't think it's unique to Japan either. Like this happens in China, in Korea, in all the other regions, not just tea as well, in all the other products too. Like if there's a lack of regulatory entity and law, or even there is, people will try to find loopholes too. Like look at the Riesling being made in Germany, but the grapes are coming from Bulgaria. Like people find all these loopholes to trying to work around and make money essentially. And business, I would argue that is really the foundation of tea. Like if there's no business, there will be no tea.
Yeah,
Learn.
you need the mythologies to create the desire, to create the demand. And it also can't be too complicated because the reality is most consumers just don't care.
Yeah,
But they could. I mean, the
but they're just
possibility for a specialty market could be huge. I mean,
yeah,
look
but
at coffee.
just too
You
few of them.
Yeah, but you could make the same argument about coffee 20 years ago. Who cares that it comes from this plot in Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, or something? Who cares about the processing difference between natural and wash processed coffee, right? Turns out that like $20 billion a year of people care.
Yeah, but coffee is a little different, right? Because like terroir actually matters. Uh,
Matters more. Well,
much
processing matters a lot too.
yeah, processing too. It's not a complete parallel comparison,
Well,
but
honestly, I think within matcha, the overemphasis of terroir is important, but actually, I think it's just more human stories, more farmers, more people doing these innovative techniques. I mean, look at Suji-san's. Like even Suji-san's matcha, I think sits kind of on a league of its own. It tastes pretty different, actually, than some of the teas from even the other Uji matcha farmers. If you taste Furukawa Seicha, especially their organic products, it has a very distinctive taste, which is really different than Suji-san's. And then if you go to like Taishi-san from the Shimizu family and try his tea in Uji, it also tastes very distinctly different. Product variability, even within the same cultivar amongst the Uji farmers, is just such an interesting study of, I don't know, like art, like interpretation, skill, method, right? I would much rather learn about, Taishi-san's processing difference than Tsuji-san's versus Furukawa's.
if they're willing to share.
But I think, part of the way that this gets solved is there's so many interesting stories and people with like very specific points of view. I want to taste points of view. I want to taste someone's like passion. I want to taste their organic fertilizer. I want to taste their experimental cultivar they're interested in. I want to taste the results of their natural, no pesticide, no fertilizer farming, right? Like it's all different points of view. And it could be much more human centric versus terroir centric than
I
matcha.
agree. I agree. But there will still be the risk of mythologizing people too,
Oh,
or
you have
cultivation method. Like look at the biodynamic in the wine world.
that's true. You have these like
I want
levels of mythologizing sitting on top.
I want my Asahi seedlings to grow from a rhino horn in the fourth days of moon
For the
cycle.
longest time, I thought biodynamic just meant like it's a biodiverse, like it's not just a monoculture. And then I went on a tour with my girlfriend in
Yeah,
France.
it's more
I was,
cult.
whoa, whoa. This is This is like,
It's a cult.
I don't know if that, it might be a bit of a strong word, but only spraying chamomile on a Tuesday under a full moon is a little anti-scientific, too anti-scientific for my brain. That's great that you believe those things, but I am not convinced that it makes the wine taste any better until you set up an experiment. So yeah. So, but that's true. But I mean, that's also just an interesting story to talk about. And there is real demand for that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, by the end of the day, I'm not against mythology and romance, but it's great or nice that we can have the knowledge or validated information to see through some of these romance. But I think the necessity of romance is there is a necessity of romance or mythology to exist for tea to be a sustainable business.
Yeah, but I think my problem is when it comes to misattributing the wrong things. Like
You
it's like
just
false education.
you just got to see through all the weeds. Otherwise, it would be your intelligent tax.
A lot of people are paying. Well, actually, it's unfair because, like, let's say that you have this concept of intelligence tax onto it. Like, there's not enough information out there to
That's true.
easily sort through this as a consumer.
That's true. That's true. The verifiable information is very scarce with
It's
matcha now.
very hard to sort through the garbage from garbage, misinformation from mythologizing, and like what is a perspective versus truth. Like it's a really it's a lot to untangle. It's like I think it's unfair to consumers actually. I think it's just a sign that we're in an early industry that this like all the wrong things are being mythologized in my
Right.
opinion.
Right. Right.
And I think that there'll be some, hopefully there'll be some correction. And I think it's just going to be a very local movement. It's your local barista that you trust. It's your local matcha cafe that you know, and you're like, you taste through all of these different things, and you start realizing what makes great matcha great.
Right.
And it's not
And
that some random can of Uji matcha is the best in the. I mean,
and hopefully, this kind of mentality will be the new norm for a large enough consumer community that it becomes sustainable for the farmers to convert or to confine into this new system. Because right now, from a purely business standpoint, this new community is not providing enough buying power to pull the farmers from the other side to this side.
yeah, that's true, and reliable buying power.
Yep.
Yeah, a lot of structural barriers, which we always go back to. But yeah, I hope that this industry can change, which is what I feel like is the
I
ending
hope so.
sentence of every podcast. It's
We're doing our parts.
we're trying to, we're trying to. I mean, we would love to see a lot of the industry switch from matcha to tencha. I think that will be a huge component because when you're starting to deal in tencha, you default or one step back in the purchasing system. So it's you get a little closer to the agriculture,
Right.
into the stories and the potentially the farmers, etc. So yeah, I don't know. So
It's an interesting future. Well, it's at least for now, I feel like it's a forgeable future. Still, we're still very early in this movement, and futures is for us to written.
yeah. My call to action for anyone listening to this episode that has any, leverage or power in whatever part of the ecosystem you fall in, whether or not you're a consumer or a matcha brand or cafe, like it is that we stop mythologizing the wrong things and that we really question some assumptions about what actually makes great matcha great. And matcha is the like of all the tea that's produced anywhere in any country, I'm like pretty confident to say that it is by far the most amount of like processing, human intervention and skill. And the fact that we attribute it to this tiny little town in south of Kyoto as being the reason why it's so good almost spits on the face of all these people who put all this work into making this fantastic tea that we are all drinking. And it's riding this name, and it's just so unfair and it's misattributing quality. And I was recently went into a cafe where I live in a different neighborhood where I live in Paris. And I went in and there's all these cans of Uji matcha, it says. And what the tag said was Uji, comma, Kyoto, comma, Japan. Anyone who reads this in France is thinking this is a single origin product and it's organic. And I am almost, I would say 100%, but 99.999%, that can Does not come from Uji. And if it did, it should be triple the price, because organic matcha that comes from Uji is exceedingly rare, and it would cost way more than the 30 euros that they were charging for that. And like that can is riding off of this name, but it's also not riding, just riding off of this name. It's an erasure. It's erasing all of this work that actually made that can taste good and sit there, like, on that shelf. It's that's the part that bothers me. So I think consumers should start being more discerning, trying to, like, pull truth out of the industry. Like, you're labeling this as single origin. Does it come from Ujigon Tensha? But same thing for the cafes and vendors, because people just don't know, and the industry has no incentive to correct anyone's knowledge about this. The only reason you could be interested in this is so you wanna get serious about tasting place, about tasting, like, and untangling and really making judgments for yourself about what's good and not good. And that's a really small group of people right now. But if we all start collectively questioning these and trying to form our own judgments based off of objective truth, we can break through some of these, what I'll call, non-productive myths that are erasing what makes great matcha great, and that's the people.
I think it's a great place to end. Although I don't totally agree with this call to action.
Really? Why?
It's a very complicated and so sticky system that everyone is making depending on their livelihood and living out of the current Uji bandwagon. And if we were ever to change the system, we need to show them a alternative way to be sustainable for them, for the farmers that I'm talking about. Otherwise, like this call to action, it's not going anywhere. It will not go to anywhere. Like people will go back to Uji because there's no alternative for them to survive or to make money. I don't know. There's no good way of doing it. I don't have a solution either. But I mean, like it's just slowly going to be more granular. But each more granular level is just going to be another Uji.
No, but at least it's mythologizing the right things. It doesn't have to be a place, it can be a person, people, processing style.
Or they can be talking about bullshit, right? You know, like after my Laotian trip, the mindset or the idea of tea is a business has never been so obvious to me. It's really the root of anything. Like if something is not commercially viable, then then it's nothing. In order for any changes to happen, really, we or the collective we has to come up with a commercially viable plan or a alternative path for everything to essentially work. You know, I actually I think one of the largest romance or mythology for tea is that tea is just tea that people can enjoy, that people can drink, and people can like and feel good. But what tea really is a business. There will be no tea if there's no business. Like everyone is trying to make a living out of, this very plant and obviously consumers are paying for it too, right? Like for this business to work. And if this circulation of money doesn't happen and that it will there will be no change for that to become the new norm. Because like right now for Uji to work so well, for ceremonial grade to work so well, for all of these mythology to work so well, is because they are adding lube, they're adding oil, they're adding fuel into this grand circle of money. And we're thinking that money is dirty, like it's keep money or business away from this pure drink. But without money there will be no pure drink, will be no tawa or tea that you can enjoy.
So true.
It's the very fact that you can enjoy a tea thousands of miles away from its origin. It's because the whole system lives on top of a modern system that's riding on capital flow.
Yeah, it's the oxygens, and we saw the case of Nishio. Nishio is one of 2 teas in Japan that had GI protection. I
Mm,
think from 2015 or 2017 all the way through like 2022, and they formally withdrew um, GI protection because it priced their tea 3 times or 2 or 3 times higher than the other teas of the region because they had to use certain production methods and only use tea grown in those parts of Nishio and I think slightly around Nishio.
mm.
And with that withdrawal, now they can like make it more economically viable because like that there wasn't enough mythology to support the Nishio farmers as a Nishio only thing. They had to bring in other material and more efficient methods to make it financially viable.
Yeah, it is like an onion, right? Like the deeper you go, it's just a more refined and more granular mythology. But, it gets you probably a step closer to the truth, which is, progress, I would call that.
Yeah. But dismantling systems that work and that everyone has an incentive to keep going is almost impossible. But yeah,
Mm.
you're right. Without money, there is no tea. Fertilizer is not free. The people that pick the tea aren't free. The tancha processing equipment's extremely expensive. Like people are buying out loans, I mean, constructing these new facilities and investing in growth. And you could even argue that even the business of tea and the way that money gets exchanged through these wholesale relationships between farmers and the blend houses, through the auction systems, is actually also just part of the culture. And that culture, you can draw a straight line through the history of making tea. Actually, matcha almost. We're going to talk about this more on the series around Uji matcha, but matcha almost died as a product. It was a state-controlled monopoly in the Edo era. You would have special permissions to do shaded cultivation for tencha. It was controlled by very few families. Those families controlled both the blend houses and the power at like local city hall. They had a ton of political power to keep this incredibly controlled. And all of this tea, the way the money flowed was from the feudal lords all the way down through the tea farmers who were given political power, economic power, social power. And when the feudal system got dismantled during the Meiji Restoration in the 1800s, overnight, the entire industry's money and cash flow stopped. It's a miracle and a very interesting story, which we'll get into, about how that shifted and how this whole industry survived, but it almost nearly died because the money stopped flowing. It is also part of the culture, all of these things, and the evolving definition of what was once a very single origin product into this, I don't know, crazy one syllable that gets slapped on so much tea. And like that story is super interesting. And it
Mm.
is a story of mythologizing a place, a history, and really endlessly fascinating. And you're right, mythology actually has great utility, and I just don't like the fact that in some
You
cases
just,
you're being told a story to like something more. It
yeah,
just
yeah.
it's preying on people's
Or
like,
just pure lies.
yeah, in a lot of cases with a lot of this marketing.
Mhm.
It's like there's this thing that you don't know you like yet, and I'm going to tell you these set of stories to hope that you will like it because Zen monks once used it. Or these bamboo chasans are the traditional way that these tea ceremony masters whisked this matcha. God forbid you use an electric whisker. It would be blasphemy, cultural appropriation, all of these mythologizing and judgments. You should only drink tea grown in Japan. Terroir is so important. It's just preying on like people. If you just connect the incentives, it's actually very dirty. What's going on underneath? It's very like malintent. It's not a pleasant thought when you
Ah,
start connecting the intentions to the mythologizing, to the production,
they
to the
just
sales.
they just want to make more money. That's all.
And, spreading culture or under the guise of spreading culture is not a good way to spread culture, I think. I think
That's true. That's true. That's real cultural appropriation.
that's so true. Those are the real violators of cultural appropriation who are making all of these connections to thing that, at best has a seed of truth. So it's for their own culture. I think that's a great place to stop. But over mythologizing is something that we all should be vigilant of, and it's very important to understand where our beliefs come from, what we think is important, and why we think it's important. So it's a very important tool for understanding ourselves. And sometimes, something deserves to be mythologized as much as it is. So we also have to, exercise judgment in all of this. And we're not the experts either. I mean, we're learning. This is to document our learning journey.
I pay my intelligence tax too.
Yeah, we've paid our intelligence tax many times over. But the tuition is well worth it to get closer and closer to what feel like closer to objective truth. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.
See you in the future.
Take care.